You know, if you really think about it, The Simpsons is pretty cool. I mean, what other sitcoms do you know have been going strong for about 33 years or so? An absolute anomaly in its field. A titan among men. I mean, say what you will about its quality at this point in time, but there's no throwing it under the bus when it's responsible for gems like these.
Lemonade? Please.
That's my name. That name again is Mr. Plow. And who could forget dear Rat Boy?
Rat Boy, I resent that.
Did you ever notice how men always leave the toilet seat up? That's the joke.
What the hell was that?
This show has brought people from all four corners of the globe together, and it served as a point of inspiration for some of the most powerful forces today. There's plenty of people who feel like its age is an impediment, and from a personal standpoint, I definitely feel that at times. Aside from being America's One Piece, in that it would be vastly difficult to blow through all the episodes and just know everything there is to know due to sheer quantity, it's clear that it did come out of a different time period. The stories they tell are timeless, but a passion for The Simpsons was born out of a different period in American history. A period of history only described as Bartmania. Listening to the Bartman, that's a quick Google search. Doing the Bartman might take you a bit longer. But feeling the Bartman, that could be a lifetime's worth of work. You can't really put a number on that. You know what I mean? Like, there's a difference between learning about it in the aftermath and actively being there to see everything. The show was built to be a subversive look at American subtext, and in many ways, this character was the cornerstone of that entire project. And that's not to say people that fit in the former category can't become longtime fans of something. They definitely have. But I think for me, there is something alluring about the early 90s and how it responded to this thing, that it's difficult for me to move past it. Like, Family Guy and South Park, those are much closer in age to myself. I felt like I got to really see something there, like a real connection forming. Major high points of these franchises coming up, though with The Simpsons would have felt like 50 years ago. They were on my level. They were cracking the exact jokes that I wanted to hear, and they were hitting the exact emotional beats that I wanted to see. You cannot tell me that Dances with Smurfs was not hitting different. I wasn't even around for the Simpsons movie. I was not outside for that. I was gushing over Ratatouille like a real snob. The thing about Bart is that he was the most divisive character out of the whole family. Whether you were for him or against him, you were part of the resistance just by chiming into the conversation. Or at least I think you were. I wasn't around for this. Beyond a loose conceptual sense, Bartmania has eluded me. But there is another character across the pond that I think I understand on a deeper level. Someone who occupies a similar headspace, a similar attitude, is literally on eye level with the kid, but is also bringing a different type of vibe to the table. America was changed by The Simpsons, but France was absolutely bodied by this little shrimp. So this dude is a menace of pure magnitude. They see his singular lack of hair bouncing down the street and they go running scared. He is the resident kid delinquent of France. There is no beating him. He was the best to ever do it. He's the only one to ever do it. And behind him you have 30 years of comics and TV shows. Nothing but pure clout backing it. I've known about this franchise for a really long time. I've been a fan since I was a little kid. I could not tell you how I learned about him, but at this point there is no climbing out of the rabbit hole. So it only made sense to drag y'all along for the ride with me as we go through the entire history of this franchise. I thought it'd be especially prescient to tackle it now, considering that they hit an anniversary last week, last month, last year. It was recent. But in order to tell this tale, we have to go back. At least 30 years back. Technically, this story begins in late 1960s Switzerland with the birth of one Philippe Chapuis. By several accounts, he was pretty much your average kid, with a bit more interest in drawing and a bit less interest in schoolwork. He came from a working class background where artistry wasn't exactly encouraged as a viable career. It's implied that there is a distant relative in the mix who was a painter but had battled severe alcoholism, which may be one of the primary reasons for avoidance around the subject. And that's on top of the fact that comic book artists weren't already known for making mad money, especially at that point. Nevertheless, it was something he decided early on that he wanted to do. As far as raw draftsmanship goes, he had an early head start honing his skills and such. After school, he jumped headlong into creative pursuits. Didn't really have anything consistent going on. For the rest of his adolescence and a good chunk of his 20s, he was considered a struggling artist. As a kid, he started his own fanzine named after one of his favorite rock bands called Zep. Coincidentally, this was also the pseudonym he took on in his professional career, so we're just gonna call him Zep from now on. So eventually, there came one fateful day when Zep was sitting in his studio that sat adjacent to a schoolyard. When the kids let out for the day, it was absolute chaos. It was pandemonium. A significant distraction, but also a point of inspiration. It started taking him back to a similar time of his own youth. He started scribbling like a madman. I don't know the exact time frame, but I'm going to assume by the end of the day he had 50 to 100 storyboards laid out for a new idea. Once he put pen to paper, there was one character that kept sticking out from the crowd. A singular 8-year-old boy of a short stature with a cocky attitude and a single poof of hair that basically doubles his height. And he was known only as Titeuf. They call him that because it's a bit of a play on words. His head, it can kind of look, he's a weird looking kid. That's the entire joke. Un petit oeuf. Un petit oeuf. Un petit oeuf. Titeuf. You see where they're getting at here? You see a joke? The first appearance of the character would technically be made sometime in 1992, when he appeared in a random zine owned by a friend of Zep's, but in the following year would be picked up by one of France's largest publishers, and subsequently shipped off with a June of 1993 release date. I think most people abroad acknowledge 92 to be the 30-year mark, but the real fans know the truth. Trying to break down Titeuf and what it means is still a bit tricky for me. It would be easy enough to just say, I'll shut up so you can go and check it out yourself, but A, most of you are American, and this is not easily accessible to you, and B, I don't think it can be everyone's bag. That's the thing, like, I don't think it's gonna appeal to everyone on the same level, if at all. The easiest parallel I could probably make would be to Calvin and Hobbes, another comic that is near and dear to me. This kid is a little older, a little more equipped to deal with the outside world. I don't think he's as sharp. He's a bit more of a dumbass. But it does carry a similar mood in a lot of ways. If you read them back to back, the formatting would probably ring a bell. I can say a hallmark of this series is its edgy humor. They will spare no expense to wrench out a cheap laugh. You got fart jokes, you got poopy humor, you got juvenile sexual humor, you got wordplay. Pretty much everything under the sun is up for grabs. But sometimes they are pulling some tricks that other strips would not even think to cover. And some of the content is shocking, but most of it is kind of presented in little vignettes, little snippets of these characters' daily lives. Said shocking content seems to come from a more naturalistic perspective. Like, the whole crux of it is that it's these little kids that are doing and saying all these things. And they just got here. They don't have many tenable life experiences. They don't truly know how the world works yet. They're just feeding into some weird pastiche of what it seems like, or what they think it might be. It's kind of similar to Rugrats in that way, especially the later episodes that were fundamentally built on misunderstandings and malapropisms. Like, they do that all the time. So while this is definitely edgier in comparison to other media, it's edgy to a fault. You know, there's always something to be gained from this interaction. It's not really just mindless bullshit. They're doing Steven Universe type lessons with the South Park skin and able. Peepoodoo could also serve as another parallel, though ironically, this franchise experienced the type of change that Peepoodoo kind of rallies against, but we'll get to that later. Look, it's a little lazy to shortcut to this, but this franchise is so French. It is astounding how French this is. Remember, this guy is Swiss, and he made something that just shook the country to its core. You can feel it. I think Titeuf's main appeal is just in being that one guy that's gonna say exactly what you're thinking, but would not gall to say in most settings. Either literally or philosophically, they're going places that would not usually be suitable, much less so from an 8-year-old kid. They definitely have the smarts and the tact to deal with certain issues delicately, but for most things, they're just ramming straight through that shit. They don't care. Within the sphere of entertainment, most of you probably already know that Europe and America have different standards across the board. Sex and violence are on opposite sides of the spectrum. Americans vibe with that violence, while the reverse is typically true across the pond. You know, a little tasteful imagery never hurt nobody, but God forbid things get a little scandalous up in here. It's all over. Yet even by their standards, this was breaking new ground. You have no idea how wild that is. And not only that, but from a small, up-and-coming French comic in the 90s, it is important to note that while Titeuf is not strictly autobiographical, it is based off of the author's lived experience. But it is malleable enough to fit plenty of other people's viewpoints. One could also look to the history of Franco-Belgian comics to try and compensate for the popularity of this franchise. See, around the 80s, there was a bit of a brain drain going on, where a lot of the old masters of established characters were either retiring or passing away, and it was up to a newer, smaller generation of artists to either pick up where they left off, or to try and fill in those niches. Part of the ingenuity in Titeuf, of course, is that it didn't fill any specific niche. It was kind of just doing its own thing, and it had enough gumption to do a lot of things that these characters from these other established properties would never even think to do. As such, his rise in popularity was pretty swift. I wish I had more figures on this thing. From what I could gather, its success was on par with the likes of Powerpuff Girls or late-stage Rugrats post-movie. Pretty big shit. The 8 volumes published in between 93 and 2000 racked up millions and millions in sales, an endless barrage of book tours, interviews, and the beginning of what would become a very, very long line of merch. The only thing that was left to do was to give him his own animated series. I get the sense that Titeuf, the animated series, was part of the strategic expansion project and nothing more. This was not anyone's passion project. I don't think anyone ponied up and said, hey, I want to make a Titeuf cartoon. It just kind of happened, as they do. And that's okay. Not everything needs to be a passion project. Zep was fully aware going in that some things would have to be diluted a little bit in order to make the show. You know, you're not getting the full essence of the IP with this one. And having watched it myself, I can corroborate that. It's not the worst adaptation possible for something like this, but it does feel pretty lukewarm. Not enough to be generic, but certainly enough to be noticeable. I will say that for whatever middle-of-the-road score that the series normally sits at, it gets way worse with the English dub. I mean, wow.
We've got to destroy every single one of those math tests.
Are you nuts? Those test scores get averaged into our grades.
Grades? What do grades mean at a time like this? You're nuts, Manny. If we don't stop those aliens, man, you're not gonna need a grade.
Titeuf is voiced by Richard Watterson. I'm not even kidding. I'm not capping. You can kind of hear it. He does a decent job. I don't want to harsh on his mellow. Like, I think he did about as well as he could given the assignment. But everybody else is just... Nah. Maybe it was just the time period. Maybe the early 2000s was just on some shit. I don't know. But, man. I couldn't finish it. I have no dog in subs versus dubs, but this definitely does underscore the importance of good dubbing. And coincidentally, the man, the myth, the legend that normally helms our lead in French is a master of his field, a true pioneer at work. And given the type of content we've been steeped in the past few months, you would not believe who his character shares a voice with.
T'entends ça, Verbe? Je sais ce qu'on va faire aujourd'hui.
I know, it's crazy, right? I actually think Phineas has a bit more range here, but it's extremely close. You might have a hard time telling who is who from series to series.
De reproduction, la parade amoureuse, la danse des supermatozoïdes. Pourquoi c'est si difficile de trouver des restaurants où on mange bien et qui sortent de l'ordinaire? Oh, elle va me rendre fou, je te jure. Elle est encore plus débile que l'hamster de Morvax. Et t'as envie de savoir comment fonctionne notre visiophone? Quand on discute avec les gens, c'est pratique, on peut les voir. Ouais, maintenant, mesdames et messieurs, veuillez silencionner dans le plus grand des silences. Mais c'est pratique, on n'a pas besoin de ranger, et comme dit Ferb, soyons reconnaissants.
The actor in question is none other than Donald Renew, a French dubber by specialty who has been in the game about as much time as Titeuf has been a thing, if not a little more. The funniest thing is that, in comparison to the rest of his library, Phineas doesn't even crack the top 10. It's gonna be Titeuf, Andrew Garfield Spider-Man, and on special occasions, Hiccup from How to Train Your Dragon. But over there they call him Harold. For some reason. I know the reason. Why am I being obtuse? I know the reason. I wasn't kidding when I said he's a titan of his field, a master in the making. And he's relatively young compared to the other masters in his field. I feel like I gotta take you through the entire backstory, because he was kind of set up from an early age to succeed. If memory serves, his mom was a choral instructor and his dad worked on sound stages for bands. So he already had the golden ticket in the entertainment. I'm kidding. But he was kind of there. It didn't take a huge leap to get into dubbing. He got started sometime in the early 90s. He's 40 now, but based on the roles that he picked up, he might have been like under 10. I think he could have even started a little earlier than that. His mom's coworkers were mainly the ones in casting and such, but based on the interviews I've seen, he did talk a little bit about not wanting to be seen as a nepo baby. So, this is his main body of work. It's taken up 3/4 of his life. And the roles that he's taken on over the years, they speak for themselves. Just within animation scope, the list is endless. You got Tai Kamina, you got Otto Rocket, Shinji Ikari, TJ Detweiler, Carlos and Ralphie from the Magic School Bus, Danny Phantom, Ron Stoppable, Kevin Levin, I mean, come on, number 4 from KND, Kristoff from the Frozen franchise, Carl motherfucking Weezer, dude! By the time he got to Titeuf, he was like 17 or something. Basically twice the character's age. But he still managed to give a formidable performance. It is undeniable that his work on this specific franchise contributed to the lifespan of it overall. There's a very specific tone he cultivated with this character that endured in the long run. 20 years in the making. It's his reads that turn some pretty mid-scripted material into something kind of memorable every once in a while. Even with old school Spidey kind of muscling in on Titeuf's turf, generally, he is the most important character in Donald's arsenal. There's no other that tops him, and it's nice to see a homegrown property get that much adoration and respect. Sometime in his teens, he used to drag race cars and shit, and he got into a really bad accident, which didn't exactly force him into voice acting, but might have led to him having more time to pursue more roles and such. Today, he's pretty involved in the esports ring. He does commentary for like e-racing and stuff. He leads the coolest life. He's doing dubbing by day, maybe theater by night, and on weekends he goes and commentates over esports. What more could you want? He even has his own talk show where he brings in other dubbing artists from the business and they just talk shop. It's great. This is the type of content I've been craving for years. For just under a decade and through 3 seasons, he and the rest of the original cast of the animated series held it down and paved the way for Titeuf to dominate, not only in France but throughout Europe. Despite the more neutered qualities of the television series, there was a viability to adapting this character within animation. So when it came time to pop the question as to whether or not a feature film was in the cards, the answer was a very simple yes.
Écoute ça! Le pur flot du préau!
In early 2011, Titeuf, le film, officially hit cinemas. The same year that other movie from that franchise came out. Not in theaters, of course. It did not match the hype, I'm sorry to say. The film itself kind of splits itself off into an A and B plot. The A plot concerns Titeuf's parents possibly getting a divorce, separating for a while the B plot concerns itself with an invite to a birthday party. Much of Titeuf as a series follows him trying to court this girl named Nadia, who pretty much almost never accepts his advances, but they do have some sort of on-again, off-again kinship. I think this film is the ideal introduction to this entire franchise. If you want to watch it, it's on Amazon Prime. You can rent it for a few bucks, and it comes subbed. It is absolutely perfect. Aside from looking and sounding gorgeous, it perfectly balances the raunch and the sentimentality of the character, while also scaling up this adventure to feel properly cinematic. It's hands down one of my favorites in all of animation, and it helps that it was especially important in the context of the franchise, it coming out during the 10th anniversary of the cartoon, and hot on the heels of the 20th anniversary of the comic strip. That really meant something. You felt like people were excited to see what was going on. You could probably try and tie it back into Across the Second Dimension, if you wanted to, just for the cinematic parallels afoot. They had their own version of Slash come in and sing a song that was written by Zep himself. There's another track that premieres in the middle of the movie that is more like folk rock, coming from their equivalent of Hall & Oates, and Hall & Oates that are just going to town and having the most fun on what is essentially a cope track. They went on national television to perform one of the tracks. It's basically the equivalent of like Steven Hillenburg and Ween hijacking Letterman for 10 minutes to talk about the impact of the SpongeBob SquarePants movie and sing Ocean Man. Like, it's on that level, because there's such a clear passion and appreciation there. It's so perfect. There's well over a dozen animation studios that were involved in this production. Some you'd recognize, some you wouldn't. This was a labor of love. One that we don't even know would have existed if everyone came in knowing exactly what they were doing. It was kind of a learning experience, in a way. Zep basically admitted, yeah, it's a great film, but I don't know if I would have made that shit if I knew what I was getting into. This shit is kind of hard. I do admire that about him, because as far as I can tell, the animated series might have been a similar case on a smaller scale, but it was something that he was involved with all the way through. He penned quite a few of the stories that were used for the cartoon himself, in addition to manning the comic strip, in addition to all of his personal projects. As far as popularity goes, I'm not sure if Titeuf peaked here, but from an artistic lens, it's easy enough for me to see this as the peak, the crown jewel. Even looking at the volumes that came out before or after the movie, you can tell we've come a long way from 1992. The way that it covers the duality of the franchise in and out of the film's context is nothing short of wonderful. And it's a really exciting development in the history of this homegrown comic book franchise. Titeuf as a character has continued to grow steadily since the film's inception. There's a clear and tangible love for this character and the world that he inhabits, one that stayed strong for a full 30 years. I'd be hard-pressed to say that nothing eventful has happened since 2011, but I'm not gonna lie, some of this shit kind of blends together. I have seen some evidence that might point to the franchise losing a bit of its edge, but largely speaking, it is still known as the bad boy of Franco-Belgian comics. It's legendary by most accounts. As far as importance goes, it's easily on par with the greats of the previous century. There's been endless tributes and statues and promotions and all manner of memorabilia left in its wake. They even produced a 4th season of the cartoon, where they switched over to this really stiff-looking rigged animation, but they also introduced newer characters and got used to a quieter mode of storytelling. It's always been a side of the comics that was transparent, but it's one that the animated series didn't exactly replicate well, or as well up until this point. I think its legacy status has softened its brand image a bit. Like, we vibe with it because people of all ages are able to respect this kid. But from a financial perspective, this is seen exclusively as a children's brand. So you have to make sure that this character is always on eye level with them. So in some negative way, I could see this being an obstacle for the franchise at large. At the same time, it seems like it helps underscore a humanity in this character that was already there. It's just a bit more easy to see because, you know, we gotta sell the next volume somehow. There's a particular strip I wanted to bring up that I think kind of foreshadowed this pretty well. It was published in the 9th volume, so this was the early aughts. We're following Titeuf take a walk down the street with this old classmate who hasn't been in school for a while. We find out she's balding from chemotherapy, and she walks us through some facts and a timeline of leukemia and how it develops. Our hero is quiet and attentive. He's not on his Johnny Bravo bullshit. He just kind of wants to learn. When all of a sudden one of his friends pops out of the fray and makes fun of her, he's close to laughing her out of court. And Titeuf stands tall and he lays into him. He just starts spitting out facts left and right. It's relentless. And when the assault is over, they share a nice, quiet moment. It was really sweet, you know? There's nothing behind that but humanity. Not exactly as good as the time Linus almost blacked on a kid on the playground in the Charlie Brown cancer special, but almost there. Like I said, they definitely had the chops to show the best of humankind in certain circumstances. In some way, I see this as a litmus test for some of the more expansive or challenging strips to come from this character. Sometime in mid-2015, Zep penned a comic placing Titeuf in the perspective of a migrant. All Zep said in response to this was, well, these are human beings suffering, but because they are miles and miles away, or because we're just seeing their plight through a screen, people are desensitized to this stuff. This character has been part of people's daily lives for decades now. If this is what it takes to really bring the tragedy of the situation to light, then so be it. There are real stakes involved here. Through 40 panels, we slowly see his world be destroyed. It's really visceral. The composition is absolutely brutal. It spares no expense to get the point across. It's constantly moving. It engenders you with a very specific type of fear and panic. And he put this out at the peak of the refugee crisis. The last time something like this was produced was probably a decade earlier, when somebody carpet bombed Smurf Village and we all had to watch that go down for 30 seconds. No, I'm not kidding. This is a real thing that happened. I reckon that sobering or socially responsible aren't at the top of the list of attributes people associate this character with, but it made a very easy transition into what would normally be a pretty difficult subject to tackle. It does sum up well why I've enjoyed it for so long. You know, it's always felt so sincere, so honest, relatively down to earth, even with all the dookie jokes. There's a reason why I titled the video the way that I did. Even if both of these characters are generally unassuming and don't exactly seem like they're destined for greatness, they've made real strides over the years. Whole decades could be partially defined by their participants, and people are willing to accept them as they are. Even at their most uncouth, they're so deeply treasured and valued by so many people. It's kind of inspiring in a way. I did actually want to circle back to The Simpsons. The totality of Bart mania is difficult to describe, even more so if you didn't actively live through it, but I felt like a particularly poignant example of its significance lies in the family's feud with the 41st President of the United States. Yes, I'm serious. It started off pretty indirectly, you know, Barbara Bush, she was throwing a little shade, there was a little bit of a tea spill going on, but then Marge squashed the beef almost instantaneously. That's just the kind of queen she is. But then HW said this:
We are going to keep on trying to strengthen the American family to make American families a lot more like the Waltons and a lot less like the Simpsons.
And this, years later, led to the episode Two Bad Neighbors from season 7. The Bushes literally move in across the street from the Simpsons. The Bushes' characterization seems to be pretty consistent with their real-world counterparts, because as soon as he sees this kid's face, HW turns into the biggest, fattest, jelliest hater in all of Evergreen Terrace. The craziest part is that Bart isn't even really doing anything, he's just kind of vibing, and he just gets on this old man's nerves.
You know, in my day, little boys didn't call their elders by their first names.
Yeah, well, welcome to the 20th century, George.
So he manages to tolerate him until he indirectly destroys his entire memoir, which leads to the spanking of his life.
Now go home and think about what you've done, young man.
And when Homer finds out, it turns into an all-out war. A prank war. Now, Homer and Bart were already doing pretty well. It's not like they needed any assistance. The episode's purpose was just to show off how crotchety, stuffy, and bumbly HW is. But the final battle was won when Barbara put her foot down and made him apologize to Homer for all of the trouble he has caused.
Sorry I spanked your boy, Homer.
Woohoo! In your face, Bush! Now apologize for the tax hike.
And he's so mad that he drives him right out of town, leaving their former home occupied by the 38th President of the United States, Gerald Ford, who, coincidentally, Homer gets along with pretty well. This is a pretty entertaining episode. There wasn't meant to be some huge, overarching message on its face. It's just some dumb, funny bullshit, just so they can have the last word in edgewise and make for entertaining television. It wasn't really supposed to be anything deep, but it does kind of speak for itself, doesn't it? I mean, the message is pretty clear. Presidency is fleeting, but the Simpsons are forever. 27 years after the fact, I think that still remains pretty true. Great characters come and go, but the really great ones are remembered as living, breathing people, not as archetypes. It was important for them to stand their ground back in 91, and it is important to make this episode in 96. Because it was important to let the audience know that people like these exist. Their insistence to tell it exactly like it is part of the tapestry that makes this series so iconic. It was obvious from the jump, in addition to being an extremely rebellious spirit, Bart was a nuanced character. The highest viewed episode of the entire show to this point is the one where he is arguably at his most vulnerable. At a low point in his experience, where he's tried really, really hard to achieve, and in his eyes, has still widely failed. There was never any need to justify his existence. He's perfect right where he is, right how he is. And you do see more of a trend nowadays with animated movies being able to get down on that level and be more earnest and personal in that regard. It's important to take the good with the bad. This franchise was birthed in an entirely different continent, and despite having cultural inconsistencies with my own, I understand it 100%. Titeuf has always found simplistic beauty in honesty. It has always gone the extra mile to just level with you. Even from a European perspective, this franchise has been refreshingly earnest about growing up and sexuality and just existing, that it has captured the hearts and minds of millions around the world, and will probably live on for decades to come. If there is any unironic path forward with this animation is cinema shit, this is the way. Stuff like this is the ticket. But in order to get there, we gotta meet him halfway. There's no more assumptions to be made. There's no more early judgment calls. You just gotta accept these things for what they are. Those poopy jokes could introduce you to some of the most beautiful film on Earth. It's lying in wait. You just have to pursue it. Because if the realest stories on this planet are not allowed to be real, then what is real?